I understand that we have very like good, well kept,
Very what?
a very well kept preservation of scripture from the first century of New Testament. Is there, like, I know how you brought up earlier with Bart Ehrman, and he says that the Gospels, it's not really, it's hard to tell if the Gospels actually wrote the Gospels. Is there any evidence to suggest they
Hard to
did?
tell what again? Who did what?
If the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, actually wrote
Yeah,
those
no,
stories?
that's Ehrman's claim because he ignores the history of the church. There is no debate. There is no opposing view. The unanimous testimony and every single manuscript copy that we have of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that have the superscription attached to it, unanimously, universally affirm Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke and Acts, and John wrote John. There is no debate, no controversy, no contradiction. The unanimous universal testimony from all our sources, from as far back as you can go, testify to the authorship of the Gospels. But Bart Ehrman rejects it. He doesn't care for it.
Oh, right, okay.
It's a fact.
Yeah. Okay, so there's really no basis behind what he says.
No, he just, because he says, well, when the Gospel's written, the authors didn't identify themselves. All right, let's assume that's true. So what? The Gospel's written to the communities of Christians, and those writers were known by those Christians, and those Christians preserved the names of the authors. In other words, if you ask Bart Ehrman, every single copy of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that has a superscription, do they all unanimously say the gospel according to Matthew, the gospel according to Mark, the gospel according to Luke, gospel according to John? He'll say yes. Is there any contradiction or dissenting or opposing views in the writings of the Christians regarding the authorship of Gospels? They'll go, no, they're all unanimous. They all agree. Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, John wrote John. So where do you come up with they're anonymous? Well, who cares? These are sources that come from the 2nd century. Okay, and Irenaeus is a disciple of Polycarp. Okay, Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyons, France, who died as a martyr. He mentions Matthew wrote Matthew, Luke wrote Luke, Mark wrote Mark, John wrote John in Revelation. He was a disciple of Polycarp. Polycarp is the Bishop of Smyrna. Polycarp is martyred. He's burned alive and then killed by the sword at the age of 86 years old. And he was an eyewitness of the apostles, a disciple of John, who met John and heard from John and was appointed by John. Irenaeus is taught by him. Where do you think Irenaeus got that information from? Polycarp, right?
Yeah.
Did you hear the argument? Now let's see if you're listening. Irenaeus tells us Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, John wrote John. Irenaeus is a disciple of Polycarp. Polycarp, disciple of the apostles. Who do you think told Irenaeus the authorship of the Gospels? Let's see if you're listening. So there you go. All right, good. Polycarp, you got it. Bam, bam, bam. All right. Okay, so Irenaeus would have learned it from his bishop, Polycarp, right? Polycarp. Okay. Who do you think told Polycarp? Who do you think told Polycarp? Where did Polycarp get it? Now answer the question. Who do you think told Polycarp? The apostles like John. So we have an unbroken chain. You know how Muslims talking about unbroken chain? We have the unbroken chain. Irenaeus' own writing, where he says Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, John wrote John. And he's a disciple of Polycarp, who's a disciple of the apostles. So that means he got it from Polycarp, who got it from the eyewitnesses of Jesus, like John. Common sense. Hello. You don't get any more solid historical information, solid history backing up the Gospels. And then let me add another element for the rest of you. One more element. Do you know that the authorship of the Gospels is a testimony to the integrity, honesty of the church? I need you to hear this. How? Testimony to the integrity, honesty of the church. Why? If the church is making up names, then why would it say Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, when they're virtually unknown, why not ascribe Mark to an apostle like Peter and ascribe Luke to Paul? Because Mark and Luke are unknown. Mark and Luke are not apostles. And the only reason why we know about Mark and Luke is because Gospels are attributed to them. But everyone got it now for the rest of you? The only reason why Mark is famous is because the Gospels are attributed to him. The only reason why anyone talks about Luke is because Luke and Acts are attributed to him. Had there been no Gospels attributed to Mark and Luke, they're virtually unknown. Even Matthew is only known because there's a Gospel attributed to him. Why would the Christians attribute Gospels to folks who are not prominent in the early church? Matthew was not prominent. Even though he's an apostle, he was unprominent. Mark is not even an apostle. Luke is Greek. If you're going to make up names, attribute the Gospels to the prominent pillars of the church, such as Peter or Paul, right? But no, they were not making up names. And the reason why Matthew is famous, Mark is famous, Luke is famous, because their Gospels are attributed to them. That shows you their integrity. They didn't make up names. They simply reported the actual authors. And because the Gospels were written by these men, that's why they became famous. Otherwise, no one would know or care to know about Mark and Luke. They're not prominent. Paul is prominent. Peter is prominent, right? John is prominent. James is prominent. Even Thomas is more prominent than Matthew. So if you're going to make up names, why not attribute it to those who are the prominent figures in churches? In fact, if you want proof of this, if you go to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, when heretics or Christians wanted to make up names for their books, when they wrote books and tried to convince people to accept the authority of those books, they would attribute them to prominent figures like the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, or the Apocryphal Gospel of James, or the Apocryphal Gospel of John, or the Apocalypse of Peter. Notice they realize if I want to dupe people into believing my writing, I'm going to have to ascribe it to a prominent figure who was known to follow Jesus. But not with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew's only known because there's a gospel attributed to him. Because Matthew is not a prominent or a better known disciple or apostle of Christ. Mark is not even an apostle. Luke is not even an apostle. That shows you the integrity and honesty of the early church. They were not making up names. They loved the Lord, and because they loved the Lord, they didn't want to lie. In fact, we're told that Mark was writing down the gospel that Peter preached. Why not just simply say Peter wrote it? You get my point? Why say Mark wrote down the gospel that Peter preached? Why not simply say Peter wrote it? Because they were not making up the names. Everyone got it?